Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me. Today we study the portion of Vaetchanan. I'm reading the first talk from the book Selections from Lekutei Sichot and Vaetchanan. A short introduction. In this week's page 70, and this week's Torah portion, we read about two significant traditional texts. The first is the Ten Commandments. It appears this week a second time, second round, and with some variations from the first one in Yitro, in Jethro. And the second one is the portion of Shema. Shema Israel appears in this week. And Shabbat, God willing, I'll be speaking in great length about Shema Israel. Let's go to the Ten Commandments. We read about God coming down on Mount Sinai, teaching the Jewish people the Ten Commandments. But the voice of God is described immediately after the Ten Commandments that it was a loud voice, a great unceasing voice. Unceasing, velo yasaf. Yosef means to add. No addition, no extra is the topic of our discussion. What does it mean that when God came down on Mount Sinai and spoke the Ten Commandments, it was a great voice? Makes sense, great voice, God is great. Unceasing, meaning that there is no additions, no extra. What is that referred to? And the Medrash will tell us three explanations, and the Rebbe will apply all three explanations to our day-to-day life. In other words, not only why God did it, but why does the Torah mention that God did it? Because there was other details in the Ten Commandments, the giving of the Ten Commandments, that don't appear in the Chumash, in the Torah. If it appears, velo yasaf, kol gadol, loud voice, great voice, velo yasaf, unceasing, did not have any addition or didn't stop, what does that mean for me studying it here today at this moment? And this is going to be the talk of our discussion. I'm going to start reading, and I will summarize some of the text so that we can conclude the entire talk. The Torah states that when God gave the Ten Commandments to the Jews, he addressed them with a great and unceasing voice. The Medrash offers three interpretations to that phrase. The idea of great unceasing voice. Page 70. Do we have the same page? Are we on the same page? A, God's voice that proclaimed the Ten Commandments did not remain only in the holy tongue, but divided into 7 voices, which further subdivided until the Ten Commandments were heard in all 70 languages of the world. First interpretation is great voice that was unceasing, meaning that the Ten Commandments God spoke in Hebrew were not only heard in one language, but they were split into 7, multiplied by 7, and that 7 each was multiplied by 10. So you have a total of 70 different languages. Just like today, if you were to take the English language, for example, you can see that 70% of it comes from Latin, 30% from French, or not 30, 20%, and it's a combination. The same is Yiddish, is 90% or 85% German. So you have sub-languages. Latin is from Spanish, right? Portuguese is from Spanish. If you speak Spanish, you are able to get away and communicate in Latin and in Portuguese, more or less. So therefore, it's a build-up. We know that when God created the universe, the idea was to have 71 nations, the Jewish people in 70 nations, and there are 71 languages. Today, there will be many other languages, but they all stem from 71. Those 71 stem from 7. So when God spoke the language, the Ten Commandments, we, the Jewish people who speak Hebrew, heard it in Hebrew, but all around the world it reverberated in many languages according to the people's language. So the Egyptians heard it in Arabic or whatever language they spoke. The French heard it in French. The Portuguese. So therefore, What does it mean? A great voice that was unceasing, meaning it reverberated in the entire universe, covering the entire globe, each person according to their language. Yes.
So the whole world heard of it at that time.
The whole world heard it, yes.
Everyone split.
All the waters in the world split, exactly. So when God spoke on Mount Sinai, he didn't just speak to the people encamped around Mount Sinai, but the sound was heard all across the globe. There is a whole discussion, the nations of the world, when they heard the nations of the world, all the thunder and loud voices, they got scared. They were afraid that God is bringing another great flood to the universe, and they went to Bilam. Bilam was the prophet. And Bilam says, no, Hashem yevarech et amo b'shalom. God is blessing the Jewish people, making a covenant with them in coming down. That's why the loud voices, nothing to be afraid of. So the Torah, the giving of the Torah affected every human being in the universe, and then in their language. They didn't need to go to Google Translator. That's one. Number two, B, the voice did not cease at the giving of the Torah. It continues to resound, and from this same voice, all the prophets and sages of all future generations derive their prophecy and insights. When God came down on Mount Sinai, after he gave us the Ten Commandments, the Torah described that the sound was great voice, unceasing. What do you mean unceasing? It means that everything that was shared in future generations on behalf of God was given at Mount Sinai, except certain people had permission to release or to share certain parts. But every prophecy, every commandment that later on, King Solomon added washing hands. King Solomon added the Vaetchanan, that you're not allowed to cross without making an Eruv. The rabbis added no mixing of milk and chicken. The prophet Jeremiah prophesied about the destruction of the temple. Ezekiel prophesied the description of the third temple. All of that, future, all-inclusive, none, no exclusion, was given at Mount Sinai, except the people didn't hear it. But as time went by, God says to Jeremiah, here are some that I shared 1,000 years earlier, and it's time to tell it to people, rebuke them, warn them about the future, describe the temple, add one prohibition, allow certain things, and all the details that came forth in future generations were all included. That's what it means, Kol Gadol Velo Yasav, great voice that was unceasing. In other words, when God came down, when we discover, when the rabbis come and says, we must follow a certain restrictions, or a prophet comes and says, because you don't obey God, this is what will happen to you. It was already given on Mount Sinai by God to the Jewish people, except they didn't hear it because it was not the time to reveal it. Now, you have to bear in mind, God is not limited with time. Time is a created being. It's like a box, putting everything in a box as compartments. But God is outside the box. If it is out of the box, you cannot question, how does God know? You cannot question, how does not God predict if it's my choice? You cannot ask, how can God get angry and then he's happy and then he's blessing? Because it's beyond time, and therefore God created all of that. And when the time arrives, meaning he's putting it in the box when the appropriate time is arrived. C, number 3, unlike natural voices, the voice did not produce an echo. Kol gadol velo yasaf, great voice that was unceasing. Unceasing referred to that there was no echo. You would think if it's a great voice, it will create an echo, especially if it comes from above. Usually, if I'm the only one in the room and there is no furniture, you would hear an echo, feedback. There was no echo. So we have 3. 1 is that it's split into a total of 70 languages for every human being according to their language. 2, that it was including all of the Torah revelations and the prophets that will come in the future the book of Psalms, all the prophets in the giving of the Torah. And 3, when God spoke, it had no echo. Clarification is necessary. How does the third interpretation, that God's voice did not produce an echo, express the magnitude and the unlimited nature of the voice through which God communicated the Ten Commandments? The first, in other words, the Rebbe says, you're talking about great voice, and then you say no echo. If there is no echo, it's not a great voice. The first 2 interpretations clearly draw attention to the greatness of the giving of the Torah, indicating that God's voice was not limited to the Holy Tongue or to the specific time of the revelation. In other words, the first one is that when God spoke, it wasn't in one language, it was many languages. Or the second one, that it wasn't just what they heard, but even the future. It was not limited to the time at the giving of the Torah. However, but extended into all the other languages in subsequent generations. Yet the fact that God's voice did not produce an echo does not seem to reflect its strength. On the contrary, it appears to indicate certain weakness. For the stronger a voice is, the louder will be the echo produced by the reverberations. The fact that the voice did not have an echo appears to indicate weakness. What do you mean that great voice, no echo? If there is no echo, it means it was too low. If it was a powerful voice, it definitely, surely will create an echo. Also, an explanation is necessary. God does not perform a miracle unnecessarily. Since it is natural for a voice to produce an echo, and a strong voice to produce a loud echo, what was the reason for this deviation from the natural order? Why did the great voice that resounded at the giving of the Torah not produce an echo? There it says God does not, there is a rule. God will create a miracle for a purpose. There is no such thing as making a miracle just to show off. Now, this is not a natural occurrence. The natural occurrence is that when you speak loud, there should be an echo. Here, God stopped the echo, performing a miracle. For what? What's the reason? The Rebbe brings that some say that there was no echo to make sure no one mistakenly think that there were 2 speakers. Says the Rebbe, it just does not make sense, because an echo is heard without a doubt to reflect the speaker. You cannot have someone else speak and for you to think that it's not it's an echo. An echo is the same loud voice. It's a certain tone, a certain high, a certain pitch, and there is no mistake. So if there was an echo, so therefore you cannot say God did not have an echo, so that you shouldn't think that somebody else is also saying the same words. It's impossible. It doesn't make sense. In addition, the Rebbe says, I'm on the bottom, 71. Another point that requires clarification: the Torah only relates stories that serve as instructions for our divine service. What lesson can we learn from the fact that the voice proclaiming the 10 Commandments was a great and unceasing voice? Okay, says Rabbi, you have good explanations why, what it means. You have one that it split to 70 languages. You have one that it went through all times in the future. All new teachings, all new words of on behalf of God are included. And you have one that there's no echo. Okay, what's the purpose? How does that affect me in my relationship with God?
No echo.
That's the first question that I was asking. The first question that I was asking, why no echo? Why does God makes that miracle for no reason? Those who say that it was to make sure no one will think that there was another speaker, says Rabbi, it doesn't make sense. Because an echo is clearly heard as an echo of a voice, and you know for sure it's an echo. And therefore, if God made a miracle, it cannot be the reason. We didn't get to it. We're going to get to it.
But the first 2 made sense. The last and the third one doesn't. The first
Right. Ali, thank you. That's the Rebbe's question. The Rebbe says that the third one not only does not make sense, it goes against the idea of a great voice. Because if you have a very strong voice, it creates a very great echo. So how can you say great voice, unceasing, meaning no echo? it must be that Ali, God made, performed a miracle by taking away the echo. What's the reason for the miracle? That's the Rebbe's question. In addition, the Rebbe says, why do we need to know about it? Why does the Torah mention that it was a great voice unceasing? Here is the Rebbe's explanation. Says the Rebbe, the 10 commandments, which we read in this week's Torah portion, begin with and are all included within the word Anochi, I am, interpreted by our sages as an acronym for the Aramaic phrase Ana Nafshi Ktaviti Avit. The word Anochi is the first of the word of the 10 commandments. How many words in the 10 commandments? How many letters in the 10 commandments? 620. 620, Keter, ground. And Keter includes 613 plus the 7 commandments that King Solomon in his court added. So you have 620 in total. Now, the first word is not Hebrew. Anochi is translated to I am, is actually Aramaic. However, the rabbis tell us that it's 4 letters, Aleph, Nun, Chaf, Yud, making the acronym Ana Nafshi, I, my soul, Ktaviti Avit, put myself in my writing. In other words, that God put his essence in his Torah. Interpreted by our sages as an acronym for the Aramaic phrase Ana Nafshi Ktaviti Avit, I wrote down and gave over myself. That is, God invested himself in the 10 commandments that he then uttered. In other words, the first word of the 10 commandments come to tell us that the 10 commandments is not just like a king who issues rules, but God put himself in the 10 commandments. Moreover, when giving these commandments, God spoke to every Jew individually. This is indicated by the use of the singular Elokecha, you Lord, in the phrase, I am God, you Lord, not Elokechem. In other words, not only from God's point of view, it was his essence, himself, invested in the words, but he also related to each individual in particular as a singular human being. Therefore, he says, Anochi, I am, you God, Hashem Elokecha, your Lord, your singular, Asher Hotzeticha, that I have taken you out, singular, not Asher Hotzetechem, which is plural. Furthermore, this applies not only to the Jews of that generation, but to all Jews of all times. As our sages state, all Jewish souls, those who lived before the Torah was given, and those of all the subsequent generations were present at the giving of the Torah. The sages tell us that when God made a covenant with Jewish people, he did not make a covenant with the Jewish people of that generation, but he brought in the neshamot, the souls of all previous Jewish people that lived, Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, and their children, and all future generations, including those who are going to be converted, were present at the giving of the Torah. Every Jew heard God tell him personally, I'm God, your Lord. It is as if he gave his entire essence to every Jew individually. In other words, when I have a covenant with God to be his child, it's not because of an inheritance from my father and grandfather and great-grandparents or mother. It is because God made a covenant with me personally, directly, in a singular relationship. It's not a bunch of us into the room and we all take an oath. When I became a U.S. citizen, many years back in Tampa, there was one large room and we all pledged our allegiance, or we all took an oath to become good citizens. It's all together. That's not the giving of the Torah. God is relating to each one individually.
The Rabbi in Shema, it says first it's singular, and then the end says Hotzesi Eschem. Why do you say Hotzesi Etchem?
Hotzeti Etchem is the 3rd chapter.
Right.
Ve'ayim Shamoa is also plural. There are 3 chapters in Shema. In this week's Torah portion, we study only the 1st chapter. The 1st chapter is singular, is between you and me. The 2nd is plural, it's the community. V'natati metar artzechem beito Yom HaKavas. Ishamru lachem. Because the first one is talking about a relationship on a personal level. The 2nd and the 3rd is talking about the community as plural. Okay? one might think that the inner relationship implied by I wrote down and gave over myself applies only to the Ten Commandments, but not to those specific aspects of the Torah which were revealed afterwards, particularly by the prophets and sages of all following generations. True, the words were not recited on their own initiative. The Spirit of God spoke through them, and His word was on their tongue. However, one might think that their words do not have the power of the giving of the Torah, wherein God's every essence is invested, but instead resembles the commands given to the patriarchs before the giving of the Torah. Similarly, so that's the first thing. Says the Rebbe, when God came down on Mount Sinai, He gave His essence in the Ten Commandments, and He made a covenant on a personal level with each one of us. You might think that the introduction of new rules or prophecy that came afterwards, or the composition of the Book of Psalms by King David, was something of a different nature, that the relationship created on the in the level of Ten Commandments do not exist. That's similarly, one might think that the instructions by the later Torah scholars were given to the Jewish people as a whole, but not to each Jew as an individual. True, every Jew is obligated to fulfill them because he is part of of our people as a whole. However, it is not the same as had their teaching being communicated specifically and personally to each individual. To prevent these misunderstandings from arising, the Torah teaches that God's voice that resounded at Sinai was a great and unceasing voice, clarifying that all the aspects of the Torah which were to be revealed in every subsequent generations are all expressions of the great voice that emanated at the giving of the Torah. The voice that proclaimed, I am your God, your Lord, using the singular, implies that God's essence speaks to every Jew individually. Did you understand? So that's the first one of the three. When God gave us the Torah, it says great voice unceasing, refer to all future teachings of the Torah by the rabbis, by the sages, by the prophets that were revealing God's word, are exactly on the same relationship between us and God as the Ten Commandments. Meaning, God speaks to you, He puts His essence in it, and He tells you as an individual in a singular verb, you are my people, I am your God, do not worship idols. So when the King Solomon comes and says, you must wash hands before you eat bread, it's actually God already said it at the time on Sinai, and He spoke to me individually, and to you, and to you, and to you. However, God did not want it to be revealed until Solomon came 1,000 years later or 700 years later and says, now we have to reveal it. So you shouldn't take it lightly. You shouldn't think that the level of relationship between us and God is any different than the Ten Commandments. Does it make sense? The fact that a particular teaching was not revealed until conveyed by a particular prophet or sage does not represent a contradiction of the above idea. For until the moment license was not granted him to prophecy, there is an appropriate time for every purpose. That is, every concept in the Torah has its specific time when it is to be revealed from the concealed matter in which it was included in the voice that sounded at Sinai. In other words, that is about the great voice that is not ceased, meaning that when 1,000 years later a rabbi come and says chicken should be treated like meat and therefore cannot be mixed with milk, it's not you do not view it as rabbinic enactment. Once it's accepted and they follow the rules that God set, it means that God already gave it at Mount Sinai to each one of us individually, except He chose that there will be a time, everything has a time and space to be revealed, and therefore it should be revealed. I want you to understand that the same apply to the variations between Sephardic and Ashkenazic. In other words, the Ashkenazic Jews refrained from eating legumes on Passover. Sephardic Jews did not accept that. Ashkenazic Jews accepted 1,000 years ago, all the entire universe. Sephardic Jews too, not to marry more than one wife, except Yemenite Jews. In other words, God wanted it that there will be a certain time, let's say 500 years ago, so it was more, 600 years ago, where the rabbis come and says, rice, beans, corn, chickpeas, all that, unacceptable on Passover. You're allowed to do business with it, not allowed to consume it, not allowed to keep it for Passover. Now for us, Ashkenazic, it's my father is Ashkenazic, it means that when God spoke at Mount Sinai, he gave that commandment to a specific area of the universe for specific people who were born at that specific time. So my great-great-grandfather that lived earlier than that, it didn't apply to him. He didn't have to. But now it does. Now comes a Sephardic Jew, moved to Israel, where in the community everybody does not have rice. He can enjoy rice by all means. Good. If somebody tried to restrict it from him, they're actually committing a sin. They are disobeying God because God did not want those people to follow it. Same is about Yemenite Jews. They used to be, they were married.
The Ashkenazi Jew that moves to Israel.
Huh?
The Ashkenazi Jew that moves to Israel.
They keep
What did he follow?
his parents' tradition.
Okay,
What's the
yeah,
question?
no, I thought you were saying it goes.
No, I'm talking about it goes both ways. In other words, that came from Mount Sinai, and there is no room for playing around and says, I want to be Sephardic today, and tomorrow I want to be Ashkenazi. There is no room for it because you have to realize God gave the Torah and it was all inclusive. By the way, it must be this way because otherwise God is limited to my state that God did not contemplate what the future issues might arise. God created the universe and he knew that there will be a time that eating rice might cause people to eat chametz, and therefore he said that there will be a time when that time arrives, I will reveal it. The sages will come up with the restrictions, and that restriction must apply to the people of that area. Therefore, if their children move to Israel or move to Morocco or Algeria, where everybody eats rice, they are forbidden from eating rice, and their children, grandchildren, etc. forever. Why? That's God's will at Mount Sinai, and the connection to God or the commandment from God is the same as I'm your God. I invested myself in it all. I hope I made myself clear because there is so much that can be spoken about, but we have two other points to be spoken. Are we clear on that? Similar concepts apply with regards to the interpretations that God's voice resounded in the 70 languages. Now we're going to the other reason. Great voice unceasing, meaning that God interpreted the 10 Commandments at a time for 70 languages, meaning all languages of the universe. Mankind at large is obligated to observe the 7 universal laws commanded to Noah and his descendants. The Jewish people are obligated to compel in an era when this is possible and when they do not have dominion over non-Jews to try to convince mankind at large to observe these 7 laws. There are 7 laws that were given to Noahites, meaning all the rest of the universe. We as Jews don't only have an obligation to keep each one of us keeping the commandments, we have an obligation also to make sure the rest of the universe follow those 7 laws of Noah. Either you forcing it if we have the power, if not, to try and convince them. 7 laws include, anybody knows the 7 laws?
Murder.
Blasphemy, murder, kind to animals, law and order, honoring father and mother.
Courts.
Huh? Courts. Which one? Surely. No? It's debated. It's debated.
Down the bottom.
Oh, where? Oh. Against idolatry, blasphemy, murder, theft, adultery, animal cruelty, and the prescription to establish codes of law. Okay, thank you. So therefore, when God gave the Torah, okay, not arguing. I accept it. I stand corrected. Now we have seven laws that were given to Noahites, they were included in the giving of the Torah to the Jewish people. That's what it means. It was translated in so many languages. In other words, God cares about the entire universe. He wanted every human being to follow and obey God, and therefore our obligation as a covenant we made with God is not just for the Jewish people, but for the rest of the universe. To emphasize that these 7 universal laws are not merely a peripheral matter that does not relate to the giving of the Torah. The Torah teaches that God's voice that resounded at Sinai was a great and unceasing voice, self-dividing into 70 languages. The implication is that even the mitzvot to be observed by non-Jews, the people who speak these 70 languages, are part of the giving of the Torah and must be observed for that reason. Not only must a non-Jew observe these laws because God commanded so, and not because they concur with the dictates of more mortal thought, but as Rambam rules, he must observe them because they were commanded in the Torah transmitted by Moshe at Sinai. So when they are practicing law and order, murder, etc., not because it makes sense, but because God commanded us. I should say today there is large movements of Noahites, people who are non-Jewish, that accept the 7 laws of Noah and they spread it. In every community, there are groups that meet and discuss those 7 laws.
Everything's given at that time. It's only coming out later on.
Right. Later on is the first interpretation. Now we're talking about universally to all mankind. So the first part he's talking about is the time periods, that when God gave us the Torah, it was all inclusive and all times. The fact that things happen later on is pre-planned. It's not a mistake or not corrections in the navigation. It's not fixing. That's the first. The second, it's all inclusive of all mankind. The fact that the covenant was made only for Jewish people does not preclude the non-Jews. The non-Jews were included in the giving of the Torah. How do I know? Because God made sure that they hear the 10 Commandments, that they hear it in all 70 languages. In other words, there is a part of the covenant God made with us that belongs to the 7 laws, to the 70 nations. The knowledge that the Torah was communicated by God in 70 languages is also important to the Jewish people, because every Jew must try to influence the non-Jews to observe their 7 mitzvot, specifically because God gave them these commandments through Moshe. The Rebbe goes on to say, the next one, I want to get to the third one, that within the Jewish people, there is also an impact on translating the Torah 70 languages. Why? Because in future generations, there might be Jewish people who do not read Hebrew, don't speak Hebrew, don't understand the language. And they understand a different language. Let's use an example, English, Spanish. You might think that this is an inferior type of relationship with God, because after all, the Hebrew language is called Holy Tongue. Holy Tongue, it's holy. Why? Because God is holy. That's the language he speaks. So when I pray in Spanish, or I study Torah, the Talmud in English, I am a step below where I should be with our relationship to God. Therefore, the Torah made sure to mention great voice, which was unceasing, meaning, according to the Midrash, God spoke the Torah in 70 languages, which means it's an equal footing. It's an equal platform. When I study Torah in English or I pray in Spanish, my relationship to God is as equal as those who speak in Hebrew. And that's why it's so insignificant for us to understand. So the first explanation that Rebbe gave is about all mankind, including all nations of the world, that they are all included in that covenant with God. The second one, the Rebbe says, let's talk about Jewish people themselves. If I'm unable, or my connection to God is not as good as I do it as the foreign language, don't think for a moment that you are on a different plateau because you don't speak that holy language, but actually you're on the same level. Did I make myself clear?
Yes.
So now we answered to one question. Why does the Torah need to bother to tell us that it was a great voice unceasing? We have two explanations. One, that it was split into 70 languages. And the second is that all of the teachings and all of the commandments and all of the rules that will come forth for thousands of years are all included in the giving of the Torah. Now we understand why, because it's very important for me to know that if the rabbi today comes out with the rules about DNA as a proof in a court, is it circumstantial evidence or it's real proof? When they come and say to me that something is murder or something is not murder, or in vitro fertilization, there are many, many topics that were never discussed before. We need to realize that this was all given at the giving of the Torah, and the same I am you, God speaking in a singular verb to me and you, applies to the teachings and the rules that the rabbis are ruling today. That's one. Number two, God spoke in 70 languages to say to me that my obligation to convince people to follow the 7 laws of Noah is part of the covenant I made with God. And in addition, when I study Torah, when I pray to God in a foreign language, I am communicating with God in exactly the same as someone who speaks in Hebrew. So far, so good. We covered the two. Now it's time about the echo. We need to talk about the third one.
What page are you on?
76. Here. An echo reflects the pattern of Or Choser, a rebounding light. What is an echo? Says the Rebbe, when a light is drawn down but reaches a point where an obstacle prevents it from being drawn down further, it rebounds. Similar concept apply regarding an echo. When sound waves strike a wall or another object that obstructs them, they bounce back like a ball that bounces off a wall. What happened to an echo? If I have a ball and I throw it against the wall, there is the energy of my hand in the ball. The energy is pretty powerful. When it hits an obstacle, instead of that stops it from coming, it has to go back because there's still energy. The greater the strength, the greater the bounce would be. Just like for sound waves. Sound waves, when they hit an obstacle, if it's a loud sound wave, it will bounce off. That's an echo. Says the Rebbe. When the Medrash refers to this phenomenon as bas kol. You heard bas kol? Daughter of a sound. Bat is like bas mitzvah. Bas is a daughter, meaning an offspring of a sound. Echo. There is, however, a prerequisite necessary for all this to take place. There needs to be an obstruction that cannot absorb the ball sound waves or light, says the Rebbe. There is one prerequisite that which without there is no echo. What's that? Must have something to obstruct the voice, to obstruct the ball, to obstruct the sound. If you have a voice that can go straight out until the energy ends, it will keep going. It will not bounce back. There is no bass call. There is no echo. What happens to a ball that you throw and it goes to Shemaim without an obstruction, or you throw it far away and nothing stops it? It will never bounce back. What makes it bounce back? A wall, an obstacle. Says the Rebbe, when God proclaimed, I'm God, you Lord, in a loud voice, nothing could prevent its passage. It pervaded all existence, even inanimate objects. Every entity absorbed and was permeated with the voice proclaiming, I am God. And the Rabbi is going to go a little deeper. The Rebbe says, you know what happens here? I have a curtain, not a wall. I throw a ball very strong and it hits a curtain, a soft curtain. Will it bounce back? No, why? Because it absorbed it. As soon as it can absorb it, there will be no bouncing back. Says Rabbi, same as the sound. If you have something that can absorb the sound, there will be no echo. Says the Rabbi, an echo means that it did not absorb it, but reflected back, pushed it out. That's my voice, your voice. God's voice reverberated every part of the universe, meaning it enters the walls, it enters the universe, it enters the earth, it enters the clouds, it enters the mountains and trees, it penetrated the animals and humans. Therefore, there is no room for an echo. So it's not a miracle. And then soon we're going to see what for, what's the purpose. But first we need to know it's not a miracle.
Why is it a miracle? If it penetrated through everything.
Because it's God. He created
it's
it.
not a miracle. It is a miracle.
Why?
Because God created that
The
miracle.
miracle is a great voice, but the no echo is not a miracle. You understand? It's a natural phenomenon. Because it's God's great voice, it must reverberate at every part of the universe. Once it enters the entire part of the universe, it doesn't have an echo. It doesn't come back. I don't know about empty. It does not bounce back. It doesn't bounce back. The giving of the Torah was foretaste of the revelation of the ultimate future, at which time the glory of God will be revealed and all flesh will see. The revelation of God's glory will permeate and be absorbed even within the physical flesh. The revelation at Sinai was of a similar nature. For this reason, it was a natural phenomenon that God's voice did not have an echo. Its lack of echo did not result from weakness. On the contrary, because it was a great voice, it was unceasing, permeating all of existence, and for that reason, it did not produce an echo. This was not a miracle, but rather a natural phenomenon. Since there was nothing holding back or obstructing the passage of God's voice, preventing his voice from being absorbed into the material substance of the world. It did not bounce back. So now we understand the third one. God's great voice, because it was a great voice, therefore it didn't unceasing, meaning it kept going. It didn't bounce back because everything in the universe had to be absorbed by the voice. We are told that when Mashiach will come, it will be just like a Mount Sinai. The entire universe would reflect God, meaning God's would be revealed within every object, the mountains, the trees, the animals, just like a Mount Sinai. The rabbi is going to say, that's why the rabbi, it's a very fascinating, the rabbi says that there was a sage that had the staff, the stick, the cane of Rabbi Meir, and the staff was teaching him Torah. And the rabbi says, how can the cane teach Torah? Cane is a dry piece of wood. Says the Rabbi Meir lived in the time, he was the father of all the Mishnah. He was the teacher of Rabbi Akiva. I'm sorry, he was a student of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Meir, when he lived a life like Mashiach time, meaning that his objects, his furniture, his whatever belonging, had reverberated with godliness to such a level that it did not obstruct the teaching, but it absorbed it. So when a sage in a later generation received that cane, he would look at that cane and were able to withdraw teaching of Torah from it. So this is in the physical world. That's the way it will happen in the future to come. And the Rabbi goes on to say that when the Mashiach will come, the rocks on which we step and the walls on which we rely as protection will scream and tell us everything we said and did. In other words, right now, they absorb the teaching or, God forbid, misbehaving, but they are unable to shout it back. What happens when Mashiach will come? When godliness will be revealed, they will be able to tell you back what you did in hiding. They'll tell you, why did you step on me when you went to do something that's not in kind, and that's in the purpose of serving God? Says the Rebbe, this is the idea that the Torah, the third reason that had no echo. And the reason the Torah is teaching it to us is because God wants us to prepare for the time of Mashiach. He wants us to know that when Mashiach will come, our relationship with the universe will be so holy that God's word will be screaming out of furniture, of objects, of humans. And therefore, today we can do that by preparing to that level and taking every piece of furniture, realizing that it does contain godliness, except it's concealed. It's not revealed. But when Mashiach will arrive, it all will come back. So let's summarize what we studied before we conclude. The Torah tells us, describing the giving of the Ten Commandments as a great voice and unceasing. And the Rebbe is asking, so what's unceasing? One, that it's spread to 70 languages. Two, all the teachings of future generations of the Torah or Jewish law was already given in Mount Sinai. And three, there was no echo. The Rebbe is asking first, why is it important for me to know that? And the Rebbe is also asking, echo sounds the opposite of a great voice. If it's a great voice, it should have a very large, powerful echo. And the Rebbe concludes, 70 languages is to show us that all mankind is included in the giving of the Torah, including the non-Jews. In addition, for the Jewish people, it implies that whenever type of relationship I choose, any language to correlate to God, including the Torah, God sits and studies Torah with me on the same language and the same level in a singular way, me and you as God. Number two, about all the future teachings, it's not new enactment that should be taken lightly or in a different category as the giving of the Torah, but rather whatever the rabbis rule and it's become acceptance as part of Jewish law, it's part of Torah, it is given to us by God directly at Mount Sinai, except God chose people and times to be revealed. Regarding the echo, says the Rebbe, an echo comes as when the sound waves hits a obstruction. God was great voice. What does great voice means? That there is no obstruction. It has to permeate every part of the universe. And the reason the Torah tells us, because that's a reference or a reflection of the way when Mashiach will arrive, that God would be felt everywhere. And therefore, when we study Torah, or all our conduct must be is to prepare for Mashiach, to learn that whatever you use, the chair, the table, the books, the language, relationship, should be as God is part of it. And because today you don't see it, it's concealed. But when Mashiach will come, it will all come to the fore. So now we have learned so much, not from the actual 10 Commandments, but from a small description that the sound of God came as a great voice unceasing. And all that the Rebbe was able to derive from the Midrash's 3 different interpretations. Thank you very much, everybody. Yes.
When he was telling me, I asked the Jews to translate the Torah from Hebrew to whatever.
Right.
It
It became a major, but